I guess it's appropriate, since this is sponsored by the Journalism Department and the Center for African and African American Studies, that the first thing we talk about is how a black journalist should approach issues of democracy and development. That term, development, is used a lot but little understood. Corporations think that what they do is development, and whatever they do is a good thing. We, of course, know that development often means destruction and displacement, so that rather than call them developers, we could just as easily call them displacers and destroyers. There is a content and there are consequences of development. The journalist should care about those consequences to the people that he is speaking to. The black journalist cares about what developers are doing to his community. Therefore, we are prejudiced in favor of the people and look with skepticism at the developer. If you're a conscious and a conscientious black journalist, you start out the day with the assumption that many of your colleagues in the profession, people who call themselves journalists, are lying about black people all day long. And you are repeatedly punished for pointing that out. Black journalists are becoming more and more rare. In fact, there are very few black journalists whose mission in life is to tell the counter narrative, which of course is really the truthful narrative about the American story. The telling of that narrative is now, I think, damn near impossible in the corporate media, because to tell that story, to do the counter narrative, you would have to be calling your colleagues across the aisle in the other cubicle and your bosses who sign your check liars. And you'd have to do that every day of the week. You won't be rewarded for that. Blacks in corporate media, working for corporate TV, corporate newspapers, didn't sign on to the mission of empowering the black community through media. Sometimes they do good works. There are as many stories as there are blacks in corporate media, but they are not a dependable resource because they didn't sign on for that mission. So there is a difference. We have to look at what kinds of assets we do have in the black community. We have to do an assessment of our assets in order to figure out what we can do, what kind of projects we can launch, what do we have the actual capacity to do in terms of projects. When we talk about media, I'm talking about a mass media that reaches huge percentages of the population. We have all kinds of media. But if we're speaking of projects of mass mobilization, we have to be talking about mass media. And if we're talking about mass mobilization of black people, what is the mass black media? We know that that is black radio. 90% of black households listen to black radio. Sometimes they lie on the questionnaires and say they don't, but we know that they do. And so if you want to reach black people, you go through black radio. There is a black communications infrastructure. It's all in black radio. Now, black newspapers used to play a very huge role in our politics, but that day is long gone. There are good black newspapers. They are very few. Some black newspapers do good works sometimes. That depends on how the owners feel. But it is likely that you won't have a good black newspaper in your community. I know that you have one, at least, here in Austin. For that, you should be grateful, because in most communities, you don't even have that. And there is no black newspaper in the country that reaches a truly mass audience, that is capable of playing a key role in any mass mobilization. There's no journalism occurring, however, in the key mass media, the one that reaches black people. that is black radio. This didn't used to be the case, but since a peak around 30 years ago, black journalism on radio has slipped to a near-death level. We have the internet, and I guess I'll just spend 30 seconds on that. And we are told that the internet will provide wonderful opportunities. Mostly we're told this by the owners of corporate media who are stealing the whole spectrum. They praise the internet more to high heaven than those of us who work on the internet do, because that's supposed to be the alternative that we should be satisfied with as a few media companies take over all of radio and television. Now, the internet has its purposes. The internet can reach targeted groups of people, confine them on the net, bring them together to have discussions of strategy. That's what Black Commentator does. We have an audience of about 30,000 very, very loyal, very influential people who turn to us every Thursday. These people were brought together by us. We searched them out. We decided what kind of folks we wanted to talk to and what kind of conversation we wanted to have with them. But we can only make an impact on black folks as a whole and their allies through these 30,000 influencers. We don't reach masses of black folks. Masses of black folks are listening to the radio. So there are limitations to what you can do with the internet. We try to do as much as we can with our influencers, but we have no illusions that we could launch a mass movement, or any combination of internet sites could launch a mass movement among black folks. So the question becomes, how do you reach the masses? As I said, we speak to influencers. We can propose strategies. We can spell them out in some detail. We can bounce these strategies off some of the best brains available. And some of the best brains available in the nation do read Black Commentator. But we can't do much more than that. Now, about a year ago, we started a series called Wanted, a plan for the cities to save themselves. We finished the 5th edition of that series in July. And in that issue, we called for a movement for democratic development. This took a whole year. And it started off with an historical background of the last 50 years in the United States, beginning with the post-World War II era. Right after World War II, the United States, with massive federal funding, embarked upon probably the greatest development project in the history of the world. And that was a project to utterly change the landscape of the United States. It was the suburban project. And it did succeed in changing the actual landscape of the United States. However, that great development plan did not include black people, and purposefully so. This suburbanization process so thoroughly changed what America looked like in relation to the rest of the world, that if you were a Martian and you were orbiting the Earth, let's say this is your the first visit in 20 years. Every 20 years you get around and see how the planets are doing. And you look down and you saw the progress that humanity had made. You have all these sensors, you can tell what's going on. And then you pass over the United States and you would have to say, damn, what did they do? Because what you would have witnessed was a radical break from the developmental model of mankind throughout history. Throughout human history, wealth has been at the center of the cities. All of the conveniences have been at the center of the city, so the wealthy could enjoy them. All the museums have been at the center. All of the things that a society holds dear, that they think shows that they are worthwhile, these are crowded at the center of the city. This has been the model throughout history and in all parts of the world. But that Martian who came over, let's say in 1960, and hadn't been in orbit around the Earth since 1940, would be aghast. He would have seen a place totally different, where the wealth was in a ring around a hollow, poor center. A radical break with mankind. And he would have flown away scratching his head talking about, what are those white folks up to? Come back 20 years later and see how that turned out. During this process, blacks began to inherit these cities by default. The grand investment, the biggest in the world's history, I believe, in the suburbs led to a disinvestment of the cities, resulting in that hollow core that the Martian saw. And so by default, we gained possession of those cities. The cities shrank, white folks left, and we remained and became proportionately a larger piece of the city. And gradually we took over political leadership of those cities by default. But by and large, our political leadership had no plan for those cities, which had by default landed in our hands. And it was no time at all before these political leaders started looking around and giving away assets of the city. They couldn't think of anything else to do. They looked at perfectly valuable city property, land, and tried to figure out a way to give it away to a corporation at any price. Perfectly good city-owned buildings or private buildings that the city could have taken over for its purposes, and gave them away to private companies, sometimes for nothing at all. Please come back. They then started giving away the tax revenue base of the cities, distributing tax abatements for 20 years, guaranteeing that the next generation is also going to have to foot a disproportionate amount of the tax bill for corporations that are resident but paying no taxes because the mayor 20 years ago gave the place away. This stemmed from a general attitude, maybe a panic, these cities haven't fallen into our hands, that the city really had no value, and that the people of the cities, the poorer people in the cities, were not assets but liabilities. And so if you enter with that kind of logic, then it is logical that you start giving away these city assets and being glad just to have the presence of a corporation and acceding to whatever terms that corporation demanded for his entrance. This actually was the political end of the road, although folks didn't know it, of black politics. It brings us, in fact, to black urban politics today. We still don't have a plan. And so what is most necessary is that we re-examine our cities. We look at them anew and say, what is worthwhile here? Are we in a good bargaining position? How can we demand more? What is the price that we should charge to people who say they're going to develop us? Now, after, I would say, you really can't put a year on these things, but around the mid-'80s, it became clear that suburbanization had run its course, that it had reached a point of diminishing returns, and that capital and wealthy people were looking again at the cities, that they were reconsidering that radical break with human development that was called suburbanization. And they were ready to begin slowly to reinvest in the urban centers. Whenever that happens, that means that the cities are becoming wealthier, or rather they're becoming more valuable and potentially being placed in a better bargaining position to deal with developers. However, in almost every case, black leadership in the urban centers continued to give away the store, continued to provide tax abatements, continued to give away what was left of the assets. I'll give you an example from the place that I live in today, Jersey City, New Jersey. Jersey City, New Jersey has the best view of Manhattan that one could ever have. It is therefore extremely valuable. Manhattan has been become so crowded in terms of office space that they can't accommodate these businesses anymore. And so it's a seller's market in terms of Jersey City. Corporations should be beating down the door to come to Jersey City and to get that view and to be 2 miles from Manhattan. And they would, except Jersey City continues to give them tax abatements, continues to give them other kinds of city properties, and tax abatements lasting 20 and 30 years. That same model of selling off the assets rather than doing an audit of the city to say, how can we bargain with these corporations? How can we serve our citizens now that we are more valuable? It has not taken root. And we believe that the time is now to force that issue. We have in DC, a city that now is only 58% black. Most people don't know that that figure is dropping rapidly. We have a black mayor who openly and proudly says that his plan is to add 200,000 people to the population of DC. And that, of course, means wealthier people, and it means white people, and it means additional displacement of the population that now lives in DC. And he's proud of that. And he expects the black people of DC to vote for him. This is an amazing turn of events. So clearly, we need a plan that's not going to come from our black elected officials. Objectively speaking, we have the expertise in the black community and among our allies to take an expert look at the cities, to see how they really work, to look at traffic patterns, patterns of purchases, to reorganize cities, as corporations do all the time when they come with their plans, to reorganize cities so that the assets can be put to the best use for the most people who already live in the city. We have those experts. This is something we didn't have 30 years ago. We have scores of black architects, and we have scores of non-black progressive architects. We have social demographers. We have social demographers among non-blacks who are allies politically of ours. We have real city planners. We have all the expertise that we need to bring to bear to look at a city and say, how can the people rearrange these assets for the benefit of the folk? What actually happens every day is that corporations, who of course can buy all of the experts that they need, look at the city as they ponder penetration of that city and amass all the data that they need to show what is most profitable for them. And since they own the data, and since our elected officials don't even know what the data says, since they own the data, they come up with a plan which shows that Corporation X not only has a wonderful plan for this city, but is the only option available. And that means that progressives, the people who want to resist this corporate penetration, are at an extreme disadvantage. The corporations have a plan, they have the data, we have none. We have only a complaint. Oh, you shouldn't move those poor people out of there. Will you tell us more about that company? I hear something bad about their employment practices. But we have no overall plan. And we also have no way to wage unified struggle, neighborhood to neighborhood. That is, the affected neighborhood says, whoa, this is going to wipe me out. This is going to cause destruction. I'll have to leave the city, or my taxes will, the value of my property will go down. I'll collapse. Neighborhood Y does not have any vested interest in neighborhood X. However, if one approaches the city as a whole and engages all of the neighborhoods in an exercise of dreaming the city, of starting off from square one and saying, this is what you own, these are your assets. Let's figure out, with the help of these experts, how this city can be made to work better for you. Then what you have done is you have given people the opportunity to dream their city. And what we know from our experience is that social movements are fueled by dreams. we have to give the people an opportunity to do that and to dream something that is very close to them, to dream their street, and to dream with others who also have the same kinds of aspirations, and to figure out jointly with others how this can be done. This is how we think you confront corporate power. They have a plan, we need a plan. One of our assets is also unions. Unions know that they are in a life and death struggle, not just with this Bush regime, but with a whole model which we call the Walmart model, which is bringing the worldwide race to the bottom deep into the heart of our communities. And these people have plans and they have data. The unions have money and have access to expertise. I think that this plan for the cities to save themselves must have the union movement at its core. There are many groups scattered around the country that are fighting corporate encroachment. Usually these are referred to as anti-development struggles. They're really struggles against corporations planning the cities for their own benefit. Many of these people work through unions. So the unions are already involved in a piecemeal way in this kind of resistance. But what we proposed to a group of union leaders last year, which was the inspiration for these 5 articles in a series in Black Commentator, that we centralize this and we bring together these the expertise of these people from various disciplines, put them together on a project for targeted cities, and use them as flying squads who would go into these cities, especially those cities where there already exists a good level of organization, that is active community groups. Fly into those cities, do the necessary studies, gather the necessary data, and then bring community groups together to start that dreaming process, to start the process of creating a plan for the city, which in fact would be a counter plan to the corporate plan. Once they have invested in that plan, it is their dream. And we believe that people will fight for their own dreams. We're confident about this plan, and we're having a meeting next week in DC to see how we can jumpstart it, kick it, and get it going. But we have a problem. Even if this project, which we're really excited about, is accepted, and that means funded, and we can create these flying squads of geniuses who can look at a city and do a diagnosis. We still face the problem. How do we reach the people? Because that targeted city, let's say Toledo or Newark, may not have a black radio station that does news. In fact, it is likely not to have a black radio station that does news because very few black radio stations now do news. So the question then becomes, how do you get community groups involved? If you can't get the community groups involved, then you're not going to have a mass mobilization. And if you don't have a mass mobilization, you have no hope of political empowerment. And if you don't have political empowerment, then you will not be able to implement even the best of plans. So we see that the lack of a news function on black radio can cripple our ability to implement the best of plans, well-funded, well thought out, projects that are absolutely needed by the community and that would be accepted and embraced by the community, because the community will not know about it because of the failing of black radio. See, if I'd started off saying, we're going to talk about development and black radio, y'all would have said, what's that have to do? What does one have to do with the other? But they have everything to do with the other, because you must work among the masses, and that's how you reach them. So we see that the problem of the newslessness of black radio can mean that we will fail to accomplish anything that requires masses of informed black people to take part, that we would just have to abandon mass mobilization as a strategy. It wasn't always that way, and it doesn't have to be that way in the future. So I want to tell you about what, in hindsight, was the heyday of black radio news. As in the case of most heydays, when you're in it, you don't know that you're in it. You only know it after it's gone. And as Bob alluded to, I had the privilege of appearing on the radio scene at that heyday. I got out of the Army in January of 1970. My father was a disc jockey. He was also the first black to have a television show in the Deep South in 1958. So I got introduced to all this. That was my leg up. And when I got out of the Army, I realized that I only had two skills. I could jump out of airplanes and I could talk on the radio. And I didn't want to jump out of any more airplanes in wartime. So I went to work for James Brown. James Brown was the king of black radio at that time. He had 3 stations, one in Knoxville, Tennessee, one in Baltimore, Maryland, and one in Augusta, Georgia. I showed up in late January at the Augusta, Georgia station. And the news director met me, and he orientated me by telling me, there's your microphone and there's your tape recorder. And then he pointed to the wall and he said, these are the important blacks in town on the wall. And I said, okay, boss. He left the room. I inspected the list of the important black folks that I'd have to be dealing with. And I read the list. It was Reverend this, Bishop that, Dr. Reverend this, and on and on. Most of the list that I was supposed to inherit were preachers. Now, I sometimes tell that anecdote without explaining why that upset me, but I'll tell you. It's 1970. It's less than 2 years after the death of Martin Luther King. And already the myth has been established that the black church, like all of it, was at the forefront of the civil rights movement. Already that myth was established. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. Dr. Martin Luther King was a black preacher. The Southern Christian leadership was made up of black Baptist ministers. But they were a very small minority of preachers, of black preachers in the South. The fact of the matter is, when King emerged from Montgomery, the plan was to make a broad circuit through many towns, Columbus, Georgia, where my people are from, then on to Macon, Georgia, then up to Augusta, Georgia, and make a kind of circle that would end with a big event in Atlanta at which would be announced a new phase of the struggle. All of this was planned. But a preacher cannot come into somebody else's town and just set up shop. He has to be the guest. This is the protocol. He has to be the guest of another preacher. And in none of these places that the plan called for the SCLC to go to set up shop would even one preacher open up his church. And for that reason, you see in that period after Montgomery, you see Dr. King going to out-of-the-way places like St. Augustine, Florida, which is of no particular political importance, and then down to the smaller city of Albany, Georgia. The reason that he wound up in these strange places and not the larger centers was because only in St. Augustine, Florida, and Albany, Georgia, could he find one church to set up headquarters in. So it is a myth that the black church was in the forefront of the civil rights struggle during that period. If anything, they were in general an impediment. So I walk into that radio station in 1970 with that knowledge and very pissed off still. And I see this list and I say, well, that list can't stand, and I pull the list down. Remember, I'm just 20 years old. I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I'm going to pull that list down. And I spent the next 2 or 3 days familiarizing myself with Augusta. I was looking for the natural leaders of the community. At this time, Augusta is a backwater. It doesn't have any black city council members. So you really have to get a feel for who are the leaders. Every community has a leader. And so I found the education advocate, who was universally known as the advocate for education in Black Augusta. And then you find the black business advocate. Then you find the people who always stand up in a very small crowd to protest police brutality. And on in every area of, every issue area that a reporter would have to deal with. And I called them, or told them to call themselves, the Committee of 10. And that was to become the leadership of Black Augusta, to replace those preachers on the wall. Within about 1 week, these, in fact, were the recognized leaders of Black Augusta. Every time an item came across the wire or appeared in the newspaper, I would call the appropriate person for comment. These people were heard on the radio. There was only one radio station in town. So of course they were the leadership. Why? Because I heard them on the radio. After about 2 weeks of this, we decided, the Committee of 10 and I, that it's time to do a project to see what this new leadership translates into in terms of movement. And they decided that they would work towards a boycott of downtown businesses to bring Augusta into the 1970s out of the 1950s. A campaign, Don't Shop Where You Can't Work. So we organized that. That was a media campaign, but a very vigorous street campaign. The leadership of the Committee of 10 became more entrenched in the community. And Augusta got really fired up. This whole effort ended in a great debacle when James Brown, the owner, finally came in, threw his lot with the movement, but then backed out on the day of the movement and stopped me from doing any reporting on the downtown business boycott. The Committee of 10 people were not about to give up, and they staged instead a march on downtown. The police lined up, blocked off the street and said, "You will march no further." And the Committee of 10 kept on marching, so the police shot 4 of them dead, including one Committee of 10 member. And Augusta exploded in 4 days of rioting, which James Brown then flew in to quell. So that seems to be a story that ends in tragedy, but it is not, because after the experiences of having organized themselves and the kind of catharsis of violence, Augusta was never the same. The city never returned to the preacher model of Black leadership. Forces were let free. Folk knew what they could do, and that city was transformed. And this was an epiphany for me. I'm 20 years old. Black news is a new thing. As Bob said, we're just making it up. What is our relationship supposed to be with the community? Is there some kind of ethic that says you accept the status quo? That is, the preachers were the man previously. Are we supposed to accept that and continue to place calls to them, further empowering them? Or do we seek out new leadership to see what others in the community have to say about something, knowing that when we do that, we are messing with the political structure of the city? We are not just observers anymore, you see. We are activist journalists. With the Augusta situation, I saw that this microphone was a very powerful thing, that the political transformations that had to follow from the passage of civil rights legislation, from the default occupation of the city by us when the white folks left, that these political changes could be facilitated through this microphone. And although I wasn't getting paid much, $70 a week, I knew that this was going to be my life's work, because this media can move people. And so the next stop was Columbus, Georgia, and we did the same thing there. And I won't repeat the story because it turns out much the same way, and transformed that city. Later on in 1972 and 73, I arrive in Washington, D.C. and I find that the Black radio press corps with me numbers 21 members, 21 reporters from just 3 stations. That is a press corps in its own. That is a mob, in fact. 21 black reporters just from 3 radio stations. And we were so active, so aggressive, and so pervasive in the community that the white press corps followed us around because we were finding what they thought were new stories. Actually, they were stories that they had not paid attention to. And as a consequence of this, I saw with my own eyes community organizations that would have been limited to good works on 1 or 2 blocks. After having been given recognition through black radio, hooking up with like-minded organizations on the other side of town, and all of a sudden you have a citywide coalition of blah, blah, blah. And this multiplying, and other community organizations saying, oh, we can do that too. And they're calling us up, and we have to evaluate whether they have something going on that's newsworthy. This was an empowering experience, and showed what a black news presence on black radio can do. So now, one more thing. This phenomenon, this proliferation of black news departments, which were taking root in small cities like Tuskegee, Alabama, and Sparta, Georgia. It was not just a big city phenomenon. This proliferation of black news departments had nothing to do, or very little to do, with black ownership of radio. In 1973, there were only 30 black-owned radio stations in the country. And yet we had this explosion of black-oriented radio and an explosion of black news. The two did not go together. What did happen, however, was we activists made an assumption. We assumed that black ownership and accountability to the black community went hand in hand. That if Brother Jones got a station, that he would be someone we could talk to. That of course he would have ample news and public affairs programming. That Brother Jones was on our side. We didn't even think about the possibility of anything else. It was an assumption on our part. And so the black body politic in general invested all of its efforts in media towards black ownership of media. Black ownership grew by leaps and bounds. Now there are about 220 black-owned radio stations. But now, back in DC, where we had 21 radio reporters from 3 stations in 1973, we now have 6 radio stations, black formatted radio stations in Washington, and only 4 reporters. 3 from one station, Howard University's, and 1 from a Viacom station. And the 4 other black stations carry no news at all. They're owned by Cathy Hughes, who owns the biggest chain of black radio stations in the country, 67 of them. Her policy at all of her radio stations is no news. And in fact, Radio 1's news policy is identical to the big boogeyman that everybody badmouths, Clear Channel. Clear Channel owns 49 stations that broadcast to black audiences. Cathy Hughes owns 67. Cathy Hughes's corporate no-news footprint is heavier on the black community than Clear Channel's is. She is a clearer and more present danger to black empowerment than Clear Channel is. When you multiply that situation across the country, we see that we face a crisis. We have to confront the Walmart model. We have to organize against corporate encroachment on our cities that threaten to destroy black and brown majorities in those cities, that threaten to displace whole populations and not only cause untold suffering among the displaced, but to displace us as a voting bloc and thereby limit for the foreseeable future our political power. But we can't mobilize as effectively as we need to without black radio. And so we see that if we're going to move forward on any project, not necessarily just a movement for democratic development, but on any project that requires mass mobilization, we must also move against those black formatted radio stations, whether they are black owned or not. and make them responsive to the news needs of the community. We have, objectively speaking, everything that we need. We have all the expertise we need. We have far more troops and far more expertise than we did in 1960, for example. We have more financial resources and firmer allies than we did in 1960. Objectively, we are in very good shape. We have probably 500 black-oriented radio stations that ought to be covering our activities so that we have an informed and aware black public. Objectively, the hardware is there. The radio stations are there. We are in good shape if we can pull those two things together. So all we have to do, actually, is get to work. Thank you.
I'm curious whether there's anything to be said for quote-unquote mainstreaming black issues. That is, Latino USA has got a very successful show on NPR. There are community-owned radio stations that are not specifically about black issues, but try to work on local community issues with a variety of different groups. That's the first question. And the second question is to ask you to comment a little bit about the role of Black Commentator, but the black officials who have been at the head of the U.S. administration and the war on Iraq, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, and what the community response to that has been. And I know you've done quite a bit of insightful reporting on Condoleezza Rice in particular. If you could say more about that as well.
In terms of mainstreaming, that is dealing with corporate media and with public radio and television, we're not opposed to black folks being on corporate media or on public radio and television. That can be all to the good. We don't count that as a dependable resource. What I was speaking from the standpoint of a person who was involved in trying to create a mass movement. And one has to have dependable resources as part of that plan. Black folks and progressives of all colors are potential resources in public media and some in corporate media. But you can't count on them being dependable resources because, as I said, they didn't sign off on that project. But we should be able to compel black radio, which is licensed to speak to that community. We should be able to compel them to respond. And so there's a difference. Looking at black radio and the mainstream, as you say, as separate does not mean that there are new uses for mainstream types. However, I do want to say something about black folks in corporate media. I think I misspoke when I said they, or indicated that they do no harm. Sometimes they do, in fact, great harm. When stories are reported that have embedded in them racist assumptions, politically hostile assumptions, and those assumptions are transmitted through a black face, those assumptions are legitimized to black people through that black face. I've often said that the only advantage that black folks have in America is our skepticism. We don't have any special sources of information. We see the same things that everybody else does. We don't necessarily think we're smarter than anybody else. But what we do have is a skepticism of what any white person says. Anything a white person says is suspect. And that's a great asset to have, because most of what powerful white people are saying to you is a lie or to your detriment. So you should be skeptical, you see. But when you have black spokesmen, whether they're on television or at the State Department, well then our defenses break down. And this can be quite destructive of us. So we're glad to see black folks in corporate media. Hope they do good things every once in a while. But they are even more dangerous to us than their white colleagues when they transmit messages that have hostile and racist assumptions embedded in them. Now, role of BC. Let me see. I wrote down the note, but I don't.
The second question about
Yeah.
The role of Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in terms of the coverage that blackcommentator.com gives and the response of the community to the criticism that.
Well, you know, our audience is a very intelligent audience because we pick them. We didn't go looking for everybody. We picked people who we thought were influential, and influential in the right way. So we of course are quite hostile to Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and the rest, and I'll explain why. But we don't get letters of indignation, too many, complaining about our hostility to them, because they're pissed off at them too. They are just as angry as we are. Now, Condoleezza and Colin and the rest, it's the same argument as with the appointed folk in the newsroom. Those are not our people. We don't hire the black reporters for local television and newspapers. Somebody else hires them. All right? They're not answerable to us. They're answerable to whoever hired them. To that extent, they are really not our assets, you see. And we expect them to cover their butts. We expect them to not endanger their jobs. All right? So we really early on tried not to get down and dirty and personal about Colin and Condoleezza. But we found it impossible because there are elements in the community that keep on embracing them, giving her awards and acting like Colin is somehow different from the other war criminals that he works with. And so at the end of the day, you have to get down and dirty because these appointees who are supposed to represent an alternative black political leadership. You have to understand this is part of a larger scheme of things. They only have value to the right wing to the extent that we tolerate them. When you have a front man, he loses his value if he is denounced by the people he's supposed to be fronting to. You see what I'm saying? You see. So if, for example, you send out your front man into the black community to show that the right wing really does care about black people, if that front person is heckled, harangued, and run out of town, he or she has no more value to them. So we decided early on at Black Commentator that we would begin to denounce Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice at every opportunity in the harshest language and have fun doing it. Hoping to lower the bar of civility regarding those people. I don't know if we've had much success, but we have enjoyed it. Anyone else?
You mentioned the number of stations owned by Kathy Hughes.
67, my last time I looked.
Could you comment more about why they decided not to have a news department? Was it bottom line that didn't want to spend the money, or just why no news department?
Yes, nobody wants to spend the money, although Kathy's stations are hugely profitable. By the way, black radio is in general extremely profitable. I have never seen a radio station go out of business, except in cases of the grossest mismanagement, not paying your taxes, getting the tower padlocked because you didn't pay your taxes, but not because of standard business. Radio is very profitable. The overhead is quite low. People will work for you for nothing. You know, you really have to be a very poor business person to go bankrupt in radio. Now, Kathy's properties are quite valuable. Why doesn't she do news? Why don't the rest of them do news? They don't do news because they're not forced to. It's not just the cost of news. News doesn't cost much. You don't have to have, in today's day and age, news trucks roaming all around. All you need is a telephone and a tape recorder. The reason that stations are hostile to news, on top of just wanting to cut everything that they can cut out, is because news generates controversy. That's what news is supposed to do. And if you have a news department, people start calling it up and saying, we ought to do this, we ought to demonstrate at such and such place. Activist organizations will be contacting you. And if you become their megaphone, the forces that they are organizing against get mad at the station. So the station knows that if it has a news department and if there's a Glen Ford at that news department, the station is going to be in the thick of controversy involving people who they don't want to make angry, involving advertisers, involving the mayor, you see. So if they can get away with it, they will divest themselves of any news department. It's more of a political reason than a bottom line reason, especially when you're talking about stations like Kathy Hughes' stations in DC that are probably billing about $20 million a year. A news department would cost her about $120,000 a year. So there's really no comparison here. She doesn't want news because of political reasons. I don't know if she's a Republican or not. It's rumored.
How do you see the difference in black radio if either candidate is elected? Or how do you see the future of black radio after this election?
All of the media corporations are hoping that Bush wins. The head of Viacom last year stated publicly at a forum that the Republican administration was better for Viacom, and therefore better for all the other media giants, than a Democratic administration should be. And he said, I'm paraphrasing him, I vote for Viacom. That was telling everybody on down the line at the Viacom group, which is CBS News and BET now, that your boss wants the Republicans to win. We will see under another Republican regime, and maybe even under a Kerry regime. I mean, he's very close to the big media giants. A continuation of furthering of the consolidation of media. That means that fewer corporations will own more and more of it, and you will see more and more of the same thing. It will mean that there will be no pressure from the federal government on Kathy Hughes or on Clear Channel to provide community services such as news. But you know, that really doesn't matter to us, because the way we're going to take back black radio is to organize at the community level. Media, but specifically radio, is the weak link in the corporate chain. All a radio station really has is its reputation. The tower is not valuable. The physical plant is no big thing. All it has is its reputation and the perception that it has a relationship to the community. Advertisers buy into what they call a positive environment. My commercial airs on this station, and therefore my message is received in a black-friendly environment. Once you mess with that reputation, once you taint the reputation of the station, you have harmed them greatly, and management is not going to risk that kind of harm, which can be inflicted by a relatively small number of people. You know, radio stations do remotes all the time. They go out into the community. They go into nightclubs. They have a good time and bring good feeling everywhere. And a good time was had by all. But you can wreck that good time. You see, you can make them pay. You can put at risk a whole lot more than the cost of a news operation yearly. So we with minimal organization, can take back radio, black radio, through confrontation and negotiation with the owners, no matter what the FCC does, no matter which regime is in power. That's an inter-black thing. We can do this. Oh, that's you. Oh.
First of all, you said that when you started Black Commentator, you went out looking for specific people to be in that audience. And I wanted to ask two questions. One is just to make it clear that that doesn't mean you have to be invited to go to Black Commentator. It's not a subscription service, that it's free. I didn't want people to get the impression.
Okay, yeah, let me explain that.
You obviously did have a plan to reach certain people, and who did you try to reach toward what end?
By 2.5 years ago, it was clear that everybody who was doing serious work had a site on the internet, that was mandatory. There was a presence there. And therefore, if your practice was efficient and effective, you could find everybody in the category of folks that you wanted on the net. You could get their internet address. We started off with this plan. We will target everybody black, period. That is, every organization that is affirmatively black, says they're black, or whatever, or Afro something in their name. That's quite enough to send a notification to. On the non-black side, we basically knew what kinds of organizations we were going to try to penetrate. And on the white left, to be very frank, we being reporters, we kind of know what's going on. And so that would be left union folks, peace activists, welfare activists, a whole range of people that basically we could identify. And then we set about the work of cutting and pasting, one by one, email addresses until we had 10,000. I had to do that. Oh man, 18 hours a day. But finally we had our 10,000. And the 10,000 meant we didn't see those as individuals because we weren't going after individuals. We were going after organizations, which meant that we were going after cohorts of people. And all you have to do is penetrate a cohort, a circle of folk, 15 folk who work together. If you penetrate the cohort and your product, your magazine, is good, it serves their purposes, eventually all 15 are going to know about Black Commentator, and they will tell other people. So the 10,000 may seem like a small figure. It grew with more cutting and pasting to 20,000, and now it's many times that. But actually, it is much more effective in penetrating than you would think, because you're getting into the circles of influencers. That's what I meant about inviting them in. We found their addresses and invited them to read, and that's how it happened. And that's something you could only do on the internet. Yes?
I see black reporters on the news all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question to you would be, although I do admit, when they're on the news, would it not be for the color of their skin? Mm-hmm. You would think they were white.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, what major differences would there obviously be in the way blacks would report the news from a black perspective, if that's what I understand?
Well, if we're talking about black radio, then the mission is to serve that community. That is, a radio station is licensed to serve a segment of the population. You apply for a license and you say, we think this community is underserved, or we can better serve it, and you spell out who that community is. So with black radio, we don't have the problem of speaking to a general audience and getting the message lost there. We're talking to black folks. Now it becomes a news decision. It always has to come down to that. It always has to come down to somebody saying this is what's important. But once you have narrowed the field down and you say, no, this is what's important to black folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I think you will find most conscientious journalists, black journalists, and just wannabe black journalists, will go down a similar path. There is a consensus, a political consensus that exists in the black community. That doesn't mean that we all think alike, but there are a range of issues on which we all agree, and that are very important to us. Police brutality, we all agree about. Not everybody else does, but we do. So we know that black reporter is going, if he's answerable to that community, is going to be exploring that issue. In practice, it works out as if the radio station is forced to serve that community. Oh, and the reason why those blacks in corporate media sound just like white folks is because they're reading the same copy. There is no difference in the copy. These are news readers by and large, or as Greg Palast calls them, news actors. And so they have the same script, so of course they sound just alike. They are interchangeable. I personally see no social value there, except in terms of role models. And I think that's kind of overrated if they're reading the same script as people who are hostile to our interests.
One more question, please. What do you think of black talk radio? I mean, there's a lot of that.
I was just on this morning with Reverend Garrett, and he likes Black Commentator, and I think it's a wonderful show. Black talk radio is fine. What we need is informed talk on the radio. And so you're not going to get informed talk on the radio unless you have news that's informing the listeners. So talk radio performs its function, but is no substitute at all for news. In fact, it needs to be in an environment of news in order to become the best talk radio that it can be.
I would assume that you talk to a lot of people in college that are retraining journalism.
Actually, I don't usually, because sometimes I feel that I'm bringing bad news. And I don't like to bring bad news. I talk more to political science type people. And I actually, and this makes Bob angry, but no, it doesn't. Okay. I question the value of journalism schools, but that's a topic for another day.
The question a different way. For people that are coming into journalism, who are African American, who are black, what kind of awareness do you see them having of the history of black journalism in this country?
Oh, I don't know if I want to make a generalization. I find that students in general have, as a 55-year-old, I have the right to make these kinds of statements. Students in general today do not have as developed a sense of history as 10 years ago, certainly not as the students that I observed 30 years ago. So we have a general situation, I believe, in which there is a dearth of knowledge of what has gone in the past. I don't know how to treat that subject in answering your question, because I don't want to be cruel to students and seem like I'm, saying something harmful in general about them. They don't know as much about history of any kind, including black history, including the history of blacks in media. That's bad enough. Oh, sorry.
Why do you think that is? Like, what has affected that lack of knowledge in terms of history?
I don't think it's the schools. I think it's the corporate culture, which is crowding out everything that can't be reshaped and sold. And it has that kind of effect society-wide. It affects adults as well, but we see each new effect in the younger people, and so it's more dramatic. But yeah, corporate speak, and the world as presented to us by corporations is killing our collective culture. It's diminishing our ability to think. I think it's changing the patterns of how we think, and this goes way beyond race. This goes to how human beings confront technology that is essentially hostile in that it wants to trick you into doing something. Buy. That's a hostile technology, fundamentally speaking, wouldn't you say? If I kept on trying to take some money from you, wouldn't you consider me hostile? All right. Oh, sorry, brother. You, and then you.
I'm curious if your political activism and organization ever extends into legal legal battles, simply because of, or if those barriers are just too difficult to penetrate. I'm thinking of like 96 Telecom Act and current Powell Jr.'s attempts to change the FCC legislation, how that affects Black radio, and if your organization ever extends into like legal battles.
Do you mean, do we file friend of the court briefs and stuff? No, we don't do that, but we comment on it extensively. Through the legislative process, there will be no relief for Black radio that is substantive, even if the FCC's decision, the Powell decision, which goes back and forth, is rolled back definitively and permanently. Unless the Telecommunications Act of 1996 is rolled back, we will continue to see further consolidation of Black radio. In fact, Black radio is extremely consolidated right now. In the 70s, when we saw those numbers start to rise in terms of black ownership of radio, most of the new owners were what we call stand-alone owners. That is, a guy who owned a funeral home would buy a radio station, and that would be his radio station. And in that kind of situation, that assumption that I told you that we activists made, that there would be more accountability under Black ownership, it actually worked in many cases, because he was from the city, he was accessible, we knew where he lived, you see, and so you could talk to him. And so most of the increase in the 70s and 80s resulted from standalone operations. That was a very good thing. However, by 96, and especially after 96, when the caps in terms of how many stations people could own were lifted, the standalone operator was basically as extinct as the Black radio newscaster. That's all gone. Now we're talking about dealing with corporations. There need be no strategy for standalones because they don't exist anymore.
Same with the funeral homes.
Right. Yeah.
My mind is spinning.
Oh.
You talked earlier about the question, how do we reach the people? And I'm very concerned about a critical mass of, I would say, communities of color from the age 13 to 30.
Mm-hmm.
And in looking at the different forms of media, there are a lot of systemic issues why we don't value news, or we don't value reading, et cetera, et cetera. Has there been, I guess, a plan developed or in the works to try to reach that critical mass of communities of color from the age of 13 to 30, where music and videos, et cetera, are kind of clouding our minds, and so we don't have that value of reading, that sense of history that we talked about. How can we start to, I guess, penetrate that age group?
Mm-hmm. Nothing substitutes for a mass movement. Mass movements, by their very presence, change the way people think. They put reality as people casually accept it in question. Those of us who came of age in the 60s, who were 15 and 65 like me, our perception of the world was different than people who were 10 years older than us, because we saw a world in flux and in motion, a world that was dynamic, a world in which certainly you would question things because the existence of things as they are was called into question and was questionable. It might not be like that tomorrow because things changed today. I know that's a general kind of answer, but it's really what I believe. We could come up with all kinds of programs, and people do, to get groups of students more involved in activities that would focus their minds on something other than the media fare that's being offered. And all that is quite good. Remember, those kids listen to radio. Remember, 90% of black folks still listen to radio. And the presence of news on the radio, that is the experience of hearing it, you see. And it would be a different kind of news, remember, with the names of people whom they may know being mentioned. Remember the Committee of 10 in Augusta, Georgia. That makes people look at the information getting process in a different way. But again, what we need is a movement. Movements change the processes of people's thinking. It makes them expect different things from the world. And it especially has an effect on juveniles. And that's why you see people who are 15 and 65 still acting like this at 55. You see what I'm saying? Anyone else? Okay.
I was wondering what kind of strategies you would recommend for breaking out of the stranglehold of like black corporate media. It seems like they have an interest in promoting commercial culture as well as any other corporation, and therefore they would not serve the role that you would see in terms of helping build a movement. You're kind of in this closed circle where you need a movement to hold them accountable, but you can't build.
That's right. That's a chicken and egg thing. So it means we have to work very, very hard with the conventional. We have to go back to the age of flyers and other means of communication to get a critical mass to accomplish our mobilization goals. Yeah, that's what we'd have to do. You're right. These black corporations, using Kathy Hughes's Radio 1 as the model, are exactly like the white corporations with a difference. And the difference is a political difference. And this difference means that there is a difference in the way politically we confront a Kathy Hughes and we confront a Clear Channel. Kathy Hughes, we submit, has made a promise to the black community that she has not kept. You see, we can put her in that kind of position. We can jockey her, ride her into a position where she is seen as betraying the aspirations of the community. You can't do that with Clear Channel, you see, because there is no history of a movement and betrayal and we shall overcome on that side of the aisle. But we have that over here, you see. So although these two corporations, Clear Channel and Radio 1, do the things that they do for exactly the same reasons, the way you bring them down is different because of the politics of race and the history of race in this country, you see. Yes?
I was wondering, what role do you see the Latino community playing in your vision of this mass mobilization, this mass movement, this reorganization of urban centers?
Which community?
The Latino community.
Go ahead.
I dare to say, in the inner cities, we do suffer from many of the same afflictions in terms of a partnership or an alliance.
Yes. You know, I've been thinking for the longest time, the growing Latino population represents a political challenge to Black America, a challenge to do the right thing, to get right, and to figure out strategies that are shareable with other people, shareable. It's all well and good to visit other people's churches, but that is not a program. What this plan for the cities to save themselves does is say all the constituencies in the city, let's come together. We have expert people who can explain how the traffic patterns and the assets, et cetera, are arranged in the city at present and how they can be rearranged to benefit the city as a whole. And that means that every neighborhood, you see, is coming to the table if we can get that mass mobilization out, you see. And they're dreaming their dreams for their neighborhood in conjunction or collaboration with other people dreaming their dreams, you see. They're doing this together because you have to change a whole city around. But if if Latinos and blacks and others are all involved in this people's process, you will find a kind of, if not unity, a kind of collaboration and understanding, you see, that you can't duplicate anywhere else. Everybody's looking at the same map. Everybody is engaged in the same process to take advantage of this city's assets and resources and arrange them so that everybody winds up in a better situation. That's an ideal situation to have. And then you can go to church with each other later. Does that answer?
So then will ideally the radio stations and organizations consider programming also some in Spanish, considering also how many black...
Oh, that's up to the...
Black Latinos who speak.
You know, in various localities there will be different configurations of as I was explaining to the gentleman, this struggle on the black side for radio is really a black thing. I don't see any necessity for a cross-racial, cross-ethnic collaboration if you're going after a black program station and saying, no, you got to do more than music, you have to create a news department. You see what I'm saying? Now, I would think that progressive Latinos would be launching a similar campaign affecting Spanish language stations. But these stories are different, and these stations are licensed to these communities, and so they're answerable to a specific community, and it's up to that community to move on those stations. So that wouldn't be that would not be an area of direct collaboration. Although the whole anti-corporate media movement should interact on a national level. There is a common fight. But not the one against Kathy Hughes directly on a local level. There's just no necessity for it.
I'm going to suggest, why don't we take one last question, then I'll make a few announcements,
Oh.
and then if people want to chat informally, we can. Go ahead.
I keep feeling like that it's about the money. It's like, you know, Black BET. So it's programmed, and of course at that point we have Tavis Smiley with the great news type commentation, and it just seemed like if a black person finally is making the kind of money that they've always wanted to make, that they don't want to rock that boat because they still don't make enough money to challenge the large corporations. I mean, you know, what about them? You know, bringing this music in, getting the movement started, helping with the movement, and all of a sudden now they're not making the money anymore. I mean, they're actually squeezed out because the corporations got so much money that they can actually squeeze them out. I keep seeing the have and have-nots.
Yes, specifically about BET. First of all, Bob Johnson never had any intention and never told anybody that he had any intention of challenging corporations. And so our expectations of Bob Johnson, those were things that lived in our heads. He never telegraphed those expectations. Second of all, in Bob Johnson's case, he does not become the billionaire until he sells. He went into business to become a billionaire, and at some point, to accomplish that, you must sell. So it wasn't really like Viacom forced him into a position where he just had no choice. He wanted to be in that position. He used earnings from the station And instead of reinvesting them in programming, he bought up his own stock. He did this for years and years and years, and it was no secret, so that he would continue to inflate the value of that stock. Why are you doing that? So that when you finally sell, you sell for a higher price. So that was Bob's plan all the time. If you want to call him a sellout, he started out a sellout with the intention of being a sellout. All right. Now, regarding Cathy Hughes and others who are in the station acquisition game, who own real properties, BET was basically a syndication kind of thing. Well, it's a network, so it's not owning properties, outlets, cable. But with radio station chains like Cathy Hughes's, they grow in this frenzied, feverish market where big corporations are buying each other's stations like baseball cards. You know, you got a Lou Gehrig, I got a Jackie Robinson, and you see they're trading them off, trying to create structures for advertisers. I have the best numbers in America for 15 to blah, blah, blah year-olds and stuff like that. So that's what they do. And because the market is so heated and ridiculous, in fact, this involves tremendous borrowing, all right? So you burden your company down with debt because you have to keep on acquiring new stations as other chains maneuver around you. If you don't acquire new stations to block them from cornering the market, then you die. Anyway, it all winds up in a great deal of debt. And in that kind of sense, when you're carrying a lot of debt, in order to finally achieve your $1 billion, you must sell. So Cathy Hughes will sell someday, soon, when the price is right. All of the up-and-coming folk who engage in that kind of practice, who have to become indebted, will at some point sell. See? So this is a lesson for those blacks who have faith in black capitalism and hope that we'll just get a 100 station chain and keep it and dedicate it to the people and everything will be all right. The real market doesn't work like that. You get your 100 station chain and you will find yourself in a situation in which you must sell. Therefore, the only power over programming comes from the people who must confront whoever owns that station in the future. That's the point. Never depend upon the owners. That's the mistake we made in the early 70s. Okay?
Thank you.
Ever feel kinda